All right, folks, welcome back to Expected by Whom, a podcast exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. I'm Prashanth Iyer, and with me, as always, is Sean Shapiro. And today, we've got a real exciting show. First, talking about how nobody actually wants to be in the final wildcard spot in the East. Talking about how close the President's Trophy race has been this year compared to modern history. How awful the Caps goal differential is and how they may still end up being in the playoffs, and then a little bit more about quality of competition. So appreciate everybody tuning in and joining us. And so, Sean, let's just get right to it. Who actually wants to be in the playoffs in that final wildcard spot in the East?
Based off their results, no one right now, right? We've got kind of this three-team. This four-team kind of limping to the end right now between Philly and Washington and Detroit and the Islanders. And I guess we could maybe include Pittsburgh in there right now. They're at 7. They're only 3 points behind now. It is a. And the best part about all of this, Prashanth, too, has been it's not just the teams have been losing and all kind of limping. It's the other storyline stuff too. We have the team that's in third place in the wild card, inside the wild card, the third place in the Metro in Philly right now, where it's torts, so we kind of expect this type of stuff, but at the same time we're getting bombastic post-game remarks about a team where we're hearing this is not enough and they're not doing it, and then you stop and remember this team is somehow in the driver's seat right now to not only be a wild card, be a divisional, be a playoff divisional team. And then we have every time Detroit or Washington or even New York, every time they seem to have a chance where it's this is the time they can win and take control of this race, they all seem to do each other a favor and just fall off the map. I can't think of, anecdotally speaking, I can't think of one where we've had this type of race. I can think back to where we've got big games and oh man, they won. Now this team's going to win the next night. I've seen it where teams push each other. This is the first time I think we've seen teams pull each other down in the process.
Yeah, it's just I'm thinking back to last year when I was looking at Alex Lyon's numbers and how the Panthers had to go on this 6-1-1 stretch to qualify for the playoffs in their final 8 games. And I'm looking at the 4 teams, really now 5 teams have played their way in because of the 4 teams being so poor. But you're talking about, 2 of Philly, Washington, Detroit, the Islanders, and the Penguins are going to make the playoffs. And we're talking about a Philly team that sold at the deadline, has a -17 goal differential, and is 2-5-3 in their last 10. A Capitals team that also sold at the deadline, has a -35 goal differential, which we'll come back to, and somehow is still winning hockey games. A Red Wings team that just had one of the worst months they've had in the last 35 years. And then an Islanders team that has a -27 goal differential that seems to go up and down after making a coaching change earlier in the year. And all of a sudden, you've got Sidney Crosby willing the Penguins back into the playoff race with 16 points in his last 5 games. So it's what is happening? I cannot remember this. And now we're at a scenario where the playoff cutoff per Micah McCurdy on HockeyViz in the East is anticipated to be 89.5 points. And so we're potentially talking about a playoff team with less than 90 points, making it in the Eastern Conference. That's something that's happened just one time since the league went to this wild card format following the 2012-2013 season. So I don't even have words for this. I mean, we're talking about this is on par with a sub 500 NFL team making the playoffs. We're talking about something that just doesn't happen. And so, with this happening right now and all the conversations around league expansion, I mean, what do you make of this kind of collapse down the stretch and what it ultimately means in terms of how those teams are going to perform in the playoffs, and then what it means for these conversations about potentially expanding the playoffs?
Well, feasibly speaking, right, we might actually have 2 below 90. We could have in theory the third team in the Metro and the second wildcard team both be sub 90 point teams, which would be, as you said, it only was the Wild in 2016 who were below 90. So, it's in a weird way, and this is going to sound kind of like, in a weird way, I almost wonder if this becomes the argument for a play-in game. Just hear me out on this, right? At the end of the day, one of these teams is going to get over the cut line. One team's going to be 8, and one team's going to be 9, and they're going to have limped in, and someone's going to watch that team potentially get cranked, potentially by either Boston or New York or Florida, probably New York, depending on how things are going right now. And then we're going to be like, well, why did that team get in? We at least could have had a little 3-game play-in series between, say, Detroit and Washington or something like that, where no one clearly earned that spot. So maybe this is the argument that gets flipped on its head, where, you know what, maybe we should have a play-in this year in the East. Now, it would be completely unfair out west, right? Like, if you're going to have to apply, you have to apply it to both conferences. It would be completely unfair for, I mean, the Kings have been, it's only a 3-point gap for them over St. Louis, but out west it would be completely unfair. But in the East, you'd be like, well, this is not, is this cut line really a real divider between these two teams? So maybe for a second, it's the reason that we get a play-in series, because we keep trying to find ways to bring it up, and I know owners are definitely, I don't know how many owners, like I haven't polled them, but I know owners definitely know that it's a way to make some more money. They've seen the NBA play-in series and the way that's made some more money, so it's definitely a possibility. But as someone said to me the other day about and they were talking about goaltending, and it was some kind of related, but it relates to the entire league. When you have 32 teams and it's spread out, while the level of play has never been higher, at the same time, the average depth, the average goaltending, I keep going back to goaltending because they keep talking about this, we're at a spot where it used to be top 35 goalies in the world were the only ones played in the NHL. Now we've got, the Fedotov story, right, in Philly. It's a fascinating story. There's no way in a prior NHL era where there's even where the goaltending for the Flyers is that bad that Fedotov even gets a chance to play this year.
The goaltending story is fascinating. I'll briefly comment on that before redirecting back to another question here, because we're going to come up on potentially 100 goalies playing an NHL game this year. We're at 96 right now. And so there's an outside chance. I don't think it'll happen, barring some crazy e-bug situation or, having to call up somebody else. But we're at 96 goalies that have played an NHL game, which, going back to your point of really only the top 35 goalies playing this, you're getting a lot more variance added with this kind of level of goaltending being introduced, some of the injuries that have happened and whatnot that have forced it. But the funniest part about a play-in to me is maybe it is the thing that gets one of those teams hot, so you at least have a competitive series. That 15-16 Wild team that had 87 points, they were able to take 2 games off of the Stars, but ultimately, Dallas was able to move on without too much trouble in that series. But the most, I think, interesting thing or funny thing for me about all of this is we could end up talking about a play-in series to get one of those teams hot, and it could be a scenario where Washington, a team with a minus 35 goal differential, may not even be in the playoff series because they get one of those auto spots by being third in the division. And to put that in context, a minus 35 goal differential for a playoff team would be the second worst goal differential in NHL history by a playoff team. Well, I shouldn't say history, but since the NHL went to 22 teams. And so NHL went to 22 teams in 1991, 1992. The worst goal differential by a playoff team since doing that is the 91-92 Whalers, and they were at minus 36. So Washington is threatening that. So we might end up in a scenario where even if you were to have a play-in, it wouldn't feature Washington, a team that may ultimately have the worst goal differential of any playoff team since the league went to 22 teams. I can't even fathom this kind of race. It's just who can keep the ship afloat long enough to get to the season. All of these teams are essentially crawling there. In fact, Washington and Pittsburgh are the only 2 teams that have gotten better than 500 or 50% of their points in the last 10 games, these teams are absolutely crawling to the finish line. And it's hilarious to watch.
Do you think part of it, and this is kind of an emotional roster building question, because we saw, like, for example, we saw Philly sell at the deadline. We saw some other teams move guys out of the deadline. Do you, and I'm not sure if this is a self-fulfilling prophecy or not, but do you think part of it is there was a league kind of wide acceptance out east that, you know what, it's really 5 teams. It's to win the East this year. It's a group of 5. And do you think kind of the mentalities and the attitudes of management groups to basically look at it that way, the way a lot of us looked at it from outside, do you think maybe that impacted how this happened, where you look at some teams selling, you look at some teams maybe not making other moves because, well, this is not our year to make a move? I want to throw that to you just from an emotional roster building standpoint, where basically the teams and the GMs kind of acted like, well, we know it's only 5 teams, so we don't really have to go for, why are we trying to get in to play an angry Boston team or an angry New York team that are looking to make up for amends of playoff losses from last year?
Had we not just witnessed what Florida did to Boston last year, I would have agreed. But we just watched the Bruins set the NHL record for points in the season, wins in the season, and then lose in the first round to a Florida team that had to get hot in the last week of the season to even qualify. And then that Florida team was able to take themselves all the way to the Stanley Cup final, and had, maybe things could have been different if Matthew Tkachuk is able to stay healthy for that series. But, had we not just witnessed that, I would have totally bought into that idea. But also the other thing is, one of those 5 teams is the Toronto Maple Leafs, and we can't count on them for anything. So really it is 4 teams, being Carolina, the Rangers, Bruins, and Panthers. But no, I think the mentality lives on that get into the playoffs and anything can happen. And we're sort of seeing that from a parity standpoint, even at the top of the league this year, right? So, shifting gears from the wild card race and looking at the other end of the spectrum to the President's Trophy race, this is also the tightest President's Trophy race we've had, in 30 plus years. We're talking about a potential difference here, or I should say right now, in standings points, the difference between first and 7th in the league is 5 points. The narrowest margin, going back, 30 plus years, which is as far as I cared to go back, was 2006, 2007, where the difference between first and 7th in the league was 6 points. And that year, as you and I were talking about, the Buffalo Sabres and Detroit Red Wings actually tied with 113 points, with the Sabres ultimately getting the President's Trophy on a tiebreaker. But that was sort of the tightest clustering of the top quarter of the league that we've seen, in recent memory. And this year is sort of on track to break that. And so I'll sort of flip your initial question around on me, in that, you're sort of saying there's 5 teams, but all those 5 teams are so tightly clustered, and none of them have been able to break away from really the rest of that top quarter. That is there a potential that any of these teams can walk in and saying, none of these teams are juggernauts. Like, if we get in, we have a chance, because nobody could run away with this.
That's fair. That's a really fair way to look at it. It's, if you were to go into this year and I gave you one team versus the field, almost every single time you would probably, from a betting odds perspective, you would take the field, right? There's no team where you're like, well, I'm so confident in team X that I would. It's wild to look at right now, where you go through and you see this kind of, like, I just pulled, as you were bringing up, I was resorted the standings by points percentage too, out of curiosity, because sometimes that completely shifts. And right now, the rank 1 through 7 for points is also the exact same rank 1 through 7 through points percentage. So we have a essentially dead heat too. And all of those teams, while we've got some games in hand when it comes to a little bit lower, like Edmonton has only played 73 and everything like that, but all 7 of those teams that are in that President's Trophy race, all of them have played 75 or 76 games. They're all right on even footing all the way down to the end. And from a perspective, emotional, we have to play for something type deal, I think this is going to make for a really great playoffs in a couple weeks. I think and maybe that's the narrative storyteller in me hoping that. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but I think I think when you have this many teams all playing for something every night, we're playing for something, whether it's better playoff seeding, whether it's home ice, whether it's the President's Trophy, whatever it is, I think it creates a better product as we get to the end. It reminds me of, and everyone knows if they listen to this show enough, I'm a big soccer guy, right? Like, it reminds me of when you watch the final 4 or 5 weeks of the Premier League, where everyone still has something to play for. Really, and it's in North American sports and regular seasons, we don't always get that. We don't always get everyone has something to play for until game 82 or whatever. And I love that. And maybe it creates one of the best playoffs ever. Maybe it comes in and we get 8-7 game series right off the bat, and we get or maybe everyone just goes too hard and they all and they burn the candle at both ends and it's terrible and I'm wrong. But I'm hoping that this is the type of year where everyone comes in playing well. Like, obviously, those teams, even though those teams at the bottom, I feel like whoever's going to get in at some point has to hit some urgency button that's there, right? And it could be really fun, and I hope that's the case. I also I think it also gives some value to it also, in a weird way, I think it also gives some appreciation for what other teams have done really well in the past when they've been that far ahead, because it shows how, when we have last year what the Bruins did in the regular season, and we have what Tampa did, even though those teams had playoff failures, it shows how hard it is to do that. And I think this is a good case study for that. I made a bunch of points. I know you're better at processing and getting me back on track, so I'm going to let you do that right now.
I mean, I think the points you've made are terrific, because one of the things that's interesting, at least particularly in the East, is that we didn't have anybody run away with the division. Boston and Florida are still battling for the division. Now, granted, Boston's up 4 points with 6 games to go, and Florida doesn't have any games in hand. Boston's probably got it locked up. But the Rangers and Hurricanes are still battling for the division. Nobody is resting anybody down the stretch. And with the way the NHL has sort of done the scheduling, there's a lot of repeat matchups for teams that are competing for the same thing, down the stretch here. And it's sort of worked out nicely where nobody can really ease their way in, start coasting down the stretch, really taking their foot off the gas pedal. You're seeing the same thing over in the West too. The Oilers are 5 points back of the Canucks with 2 games in hand, chasing them in the Pacific. You've got Colorado and Dallas battling it out. 7 games left for both teams. Colorado's only back by 3 points. So it's kind of nice seeing that competitive fire go all the way through. What I genuinely think is going to end up happening is we're going to get at least one series that goes the way of one of those Penguins-Flyers series where there's just like 10-3 blowouts back and forth, because it's going to be a very entertaining playoffs from the goalie perspective that we brought up, in that there's a lot of guys kind of playing games right now. We've seen shifts in the way teams are using their goalies in the playoffs. We're seeing a lot more offense. We're seeing the kind of level of competition having to stay really, really high all the way through to the end of the season, all the way from the top of the conference down to the bottom of the conference. I think at the end of the day, it makes for a very competitive playoff, or a very entertaining playoff at the very least. And to your point that you made to kind of kick off everything, this isn't a scenario where there's one team that just looks incredible. In the West, there's 5 teams that you're going, man, any one of them could come out and you wouldn't be shocked to see that. And the same thing in the East. It's not a scenario where we're talking about Tiger Woods at the Masters. We're not talking about South Carolina basketball versus the field. It's exactly anybody's game right now. And so I think this is one of the most interesting playoffs that we're going to have, and I'm very excited to see that and see how things kind of shake out there.
I like that, and one thing I like about it right now is I go through one of my kind of things every morning after I actually walk my daughter to school. I'm walking back. I have about 8-minute walk home, and so I'll occasionally check my phone when I'm probably not the safest thing to do while walking on the road and other people are returning from dropping their kids at school, but I still open my phone and I'll often look at the NHL games for that night, and I try to kind of pick which one I want to watch that night and everything, or which one I might be interested in. And every single night, it's rare to have a dud night right now. It's so rare right now where you're going through and you're like, there's nothing for me right now. I'm gonna, like, we haven't even, and obviously last year there was a narrative with Connor Bedard that I think led to so much more of that, but I love that we're not talking about the San Jose Sharks. We're not talking about the the Sharks have that one locked up by 7 points or whatever for number one, but we're not talking about the race for last. We're talking about the right race. We're talking about the thing that really should matter. Now maybe there's a different podcast happening in San Jose right now that I'm that I'm missing. But I love that this is how shifted the conversation. I love that we go through and, like, we're recording this on Wednesday, April 3rd, right? Like, I go through and I look and there's Tampa-Toronto's got big playoff implications for as far as things. Rangers-Devils, well, the Devils have fallen off. There's a President's Trophy stuff on the line with the Rangers. Oilers-Stars is a big one in the West. Kings, like, every single game tonight has some sort of playoff implication, whether it's for seeding, whether it's for getting in, whether it's That's great. That's 5 for 5 on that. I don't know how many seasons we could go back and look and be like, well, a game in early April, every single one has something to do with the playoffs. I love that.
Can't get any better than that. And what we tend to hope here is that you can't get any better than our show. And so if you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Wing Wheel Podcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like the Wing Wheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which has an Expected By Whom channel, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network. So, shifting gears from the playoffs and shifting gears from the team level to the player level, there was a really interesting piece that came out last week from Dom Lucian at The Athletic talking about quality of competition. And it's something that has been pervasive in the analytics community for more than a decade. And for the longest time, the prevailing theory or wisdom was that just the difference between the most difficult minutes and the easiest minutes in the NHL was not so large that it could dramatically influence a player's sort of underlying metrics. And if you were going to evaluate quality of competition, it was even more important to look at quality of teammates, because a player was, generally speaking, playing much more of their time with a specific teammate who could then influence their sort of production far more than any individual skater could on the opposing team. And so what ended up happening was you had a lot of people saying, okay, quality of teammates was probably 3 times as important as quality of competition. You know, there's not really any player that's facing dramatically more difficult minutes than any other player. And so as a result, we're just sort of not going to pay a huge attention to quality of competition. But then enter Mo Seider, and enter what Derek Lalonde has done with Mo Seider this year, which is deploying him in arguably the most difficult minute setting we've seen in the analytics era, which goes back to 2007, 2008, specifically when thinking about the caliber of players that he plays versus the amount of times he's starting in the defensive zone. And so, Sean, I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of Dom's approach to kind of revisiting this quality of competition metric, how we ultimately factor it into analyzing a player, and then any perspectives you've gotten just from players, coaches, front offices on, you know, how the public has really handled quality of competition conversations.
Yeah, first off, the Seider story has been fascinating this year. It was actually right before the All-Star game. I talked to Mo himself about this kind of how he's viewed by the underlying numbers and how his season is being viewed by that. And he was big at the time. I'll make sure to drop the link in our bio on the bottom of this, of how he looked at winning shifts and setting the table for his next teammate. He didn't really And I give Seider credit. He wasn't completely dismissive of it. Actually, it wasn't a, I've had some players who have been like, that's BS, whatever. I don't care about those numbers. Go away. He actually was willing to engage in conversation and talk about why some of those numbers happen. And we've heard Derek Lalonde talk this year about why, how he looks at Mo as a success this year compared to what some numbers. And we know Derek Lalonde reads a lot. I've seen him. He will go through and verbatim quote things from articles and numbers and stuff that he's seen people use. And so I know he's a heavy reader. So I guarantee you he's read this piece, and I know he's told me, without telling me directly, he's told me he's read my stuff because he's used exact words from the exact lines from it without quote unquote quoting me. But before we get too deep on this, we talked about Seider. The other key character here, I want to give Dom a ton of credit right now, because one of the things that we talked about, and I've used this analogy before, but I think it applies perfectly to this. And Dom kind of talked about the Seider game versus Kucherov in the lead into his article about this. I've talked about hockey and analytics, the kind of analytical view, the watch the game people is kind of hockey's version of science and religion, right? And I go back to, I once had a rabbi tell me that good science and good religion will often meet in the middle and figure out. One was the stories that explain things until we had the science to explain things, and they often meet in the middle the right way. And to me, the data here and the analytical push and the watch the game people, it's the science and religion meeting in the middle. And Dom used that game where Seider goes head-to-head with Kucherov. And if you look at the data on it, from one of the player cards or whatever that people pull, Seider got bombed. You're like, oh my God, he's awful. He was terrible that game. But then you watch the game, like most of us did, and you're like, he locked Kucherov up. He locked up a Hart Trophy candidate. He completely changed the game, and that was how these two things don't match. And I give Dom a ton of credit for seeing the gaps in those two and being willing to say, okay, there's got to be a way to explain that when what we view on the ice is that far off from what the numbers tell us. There's something else we're not looking at, or we're not asking the right question. And I give Dom a ton of credit for going and saying, okay, how can I better ask the right question about this? And that's how we end up with this quality of competition model that he kind of has pulled and pulled into his model. So give Dom a ton of credit for that. And for me, I love having this as a resource now, because there's so many, as much as we like to pretend that we watch every single game every single night, there's so many hockey games. We can't watch every single player. We can't do all of that. We can't be completely in depth. It's the reason NHL teams have when it comes to their scouting assignments, they have guys who are committed to 4 or 5 teams individually, and that's it. That's all they focus on, right? So it's impossible to know every single player. I love now having this as a tool where, for example, I'm going to watch when I go through, this is a tool that I've kind of bookmarked. When there's a game tonight and I see that Dallas and Edmonton are playing tonight, I might go look at the defensive pairs and say, okay, who's going to be who? Give me a better idea for what their second pairing guy. Give me a better idea for what their third pairing guy does, and how he actually gets used. I now have a much better standing and level of understanding for how a player is used and how much and kind of how they succeed in more difficult or less difficult situations coming in because of this. So, ton of credit to Dom. It's a great resource. To me, it's the type of tool that honestly, it's something that should be used more, and it's the type of tool that I hope broadcasters read it, honestly, because it's the type of thing where I'd love to be at a day and age where you're watching a hockey broadcast and you get the analyst or the sideline reporter or whatever being like, "Hey, watch this matchup tonight, because we know that this player." And it's not just anecdotal, and it becomes something where it's actual fact-driven and that we can use. So, credit to Dom here, because this is a great tool, and I'm happy to see that we have this now in this hockey greater community now.
Really what the lesson should be for everybody here is that yelling at the stats nerds works. If you yell at them long enough about your favorite player, you will eventually get them to do what you want them to do. But no, in all seriousness, I want to go back to the point.
It's right though. It's right though.
Yeah.
It's right though. You yell at people and you get things done. I mean, one of my favorite.
That's how it works.
One of my favorite conversations that we've ever had is you and I will often. Sometimes we'll have an idea that we're texting about, and I think we have one in the process right now, and sometimes it'll come out, and we'll see someone will respond to it with, like, oh, I need to go see if I can look into this, and we're like, we've yelled at enough people. We've done it right. So
that's how it works, and, going back on this is something Dom and I have been talking about for almost 2 years now, so this is something he's been trying to figure out how to do. And thankfully he was able to get Cole Palmer of Hockey Stat Card, so I just want to give a shout out to actually pull the data for him to be able to do this. But I want to go back to, the point you made about marrying what folks see on the ice and sort of what the traditional hockey person sees versus what we can measure with the data. And so, for example, going back to that Kucherov game that Dom uses to lead off the story, if Mo Seider is starting a shift in the defensive zone against Nikita Kucherov, and we know that the average shift is 45 seconds or, 60 seconds in kind of a worst case scenario for Seider. What we have to think about is what do we genuinely expect to have happen on that shift? Like what's considered a shift win, right? And that's a concept that you brought up when you talked to Mo, prior to the All-Star break, and we'll link that piece as well in our show notes so you can go back and see it. But what's considered a successful shift there? It's not going to be generating 5 shot attempts and allowing none, particularly if you lose the faceoff. If you lose the faceoff against the Kucherov line, now you're going to spend 15 seconds trying to get that puck back, 20 seconds trying to get that puck back, and then you've got the rush up. You're dependent on a successful entry. It's a lot of things that most Seider specifically can't control. And now if you're talking about, 20% of his shifts, 25% of his shifts look like that, then we can't necessarily be evaluating Mo in the same light as somebody else. And so that's an important context measure that Dom was very interested in answering. And so let's sort of contrast what Dom did from what previous attempts have done. So if you take a look, most quality of competition metrics have been based on the theory that a coach knows who their best players are and plays those players the most, which I think is an absolutely fair assumption to start with. But what we have to remember is that the best player on the San Jose Sharks is not equal to the best player on the Edmonton Oilers in terms of quality of player. And that's what it is. They may play the same number of minutes because they're both the best players on each team. But I'm sorry to say the best player on the San Jose Sharks is not Connor McDavid. Okay? He is not at that level. There's nobody at that level. And so if you treat players by their time on ice and use those time on ice averages to ultimately build out a quality of competition, what you've effectively done is treated that San Jose Sharks player as the same caliber as Connor McDavid, which Dom was not interested in doing. Dom wanted to go on a game-by-game level and actually look at the average offensive and defensive rating that a player faces, and then be able to take that rating and calculate what an anticipated player's defensive rating and offensive rating would be in the face of playing those players. And what Dom ended up finding was that on average, Mo Seider and Jake Wallman faced the strongest offensive opponents in the league. Mo being the only player that faces an average skater with an offensive rating over 3, with his average skater being an offensive rating of 3.1. And so what that ultimately allowed Dom to do is, based on the average offensive rating and average defensive rating that Mo Seider faces, he could then calculate what the expected defensive rating would be for a player that plays Seider's minutes, that plays against that quality of competition. And we would actually expect Seider to have a defensive rating of minus 4.1, when the average for a number one defenseman is minus 2.2. So we're talking about a player that's effectively going to be having twice as difficult rating compared to what the average number one would be. And that is the important context that we've been missing in this conversation forever. And now that's not to say that excuses Seider's other numbers. What that allows us to do, though, is better understand what his numbers look like in the face of what should be expected. So, for example, right now, Mo Seider's got a -7 defensive rating on Dom's cards. He would be expected to have -4.1. So he is still not necessarily performing what we would expect the average defenseman to do. And maybe part of that is we're still not getting the complete picture of quality competition. Or maybe some of that is just Seider struggling in the face of very, very difficult minutes. But it at least allows us to better explain why we're seeing what we're seeing.
Yeah, another thing you brought up that I think there's two important points. First, I want to bring up is, in the past, we kind of had to trust that coaches knew what they were doing. And that's not always necessarily the case. Coaches have their favorites. Coaches have their guys who are going to get... So in the past, when you were giving quality of teammate and you were giving it was a lot of times rewarding a guy for coaches' favoritism, right? Like a classic example of a guy I covered is Devin Shore. Ken Hitchcock loved Devin Shore. He loved him so much. He played him above and beyond any role he ever should have played. And Devin Shore was a fine player. He should have been I think he's still kicking around in the league right now. Been kind of a classic 4A guy, right? But Ken Hitchcock loved him. And I remember I had a conversation with Ken Hitchcock once about Devin Shore and analytics. This is now this would have been the year Hitch was there, so this would have been the 2018, this would have been the 2017-18 season, I believe, if I have my math right in my head. And Devin Shore didn't have great underlying numbers, and we asked Ken Hitchcock about it, and Ken Hitchcock said, well, his numbers are good by the ones I want to see. And I remember asking Hitch what he wanted to see, and he said, I'm not telling you that, I never will. So, of course, never did and never told. It's like I have the famous clip. If you ever wanted an idea of Ken Hitchcock's and I relationship, I have the famous clip that I've pulled from occasionally where he says he wouldn't pay a penny for Sean Shapiro. So that's to read what Sean Shapiro wrote, so you know what he thinks of my opinion of it. But rewarding, just looking at just like, hey, this is how coaches have used guys, and coaches basically. The old style was rewarding coaches' favorites more often and rewarding guys who were pet cats for coaches. And this kind of takes that away. That this does a big point towards that. It no longer is whoever plays for San Jose equal to Connor McDavid. He's also no longer being judged based off of this is what David Quinn thinks of him. This is actually a harder spot. Taking that a step further. From a coaching perspective, and this is one of those things where who knows if an NHL team will actually look at this and bring it inside, and maybe they have something like this that they use themselves. Who knows? Because as we've talked, one of my favorite lines in interviews from this show is the line Eric Tolsky has given us, where the data that NHL teams have is like the light switch being flicked on and off every millisecond, as opposed to we get it every second in the public world. It does bring up the completely fair question to Derek Lalonde on this, and he's been asked it at times, but it is the one that he has to. I'd love to hear the more uncut, honest answer that he's not really willing to give. I don't think is he misusing Mo Seider? Is he using his number one defenseman the wrong way? And maybe he is. Maybe in his heart of hearts he believes that, you know what, no one else can handle this role, so this is what we have to do. It's this type of stuff that just adds to the greater Seider conversation. That's fascinating of what's best for the player long term and what's best for the Detroit Red Wings right now. Because those two things don't collide in my mind. It's two different things.
I think the point you just brought up is the best point and the most illustrative point that we can take away from Dom's work is, okay, now that we know the expected rating for somebody that's playing these minutes from Seider, and we're seeing that Seider is still sort of struggling in those minutes, we can then bring it back to a conversation of, is this the best role for the team? Is this the best role for the player? And, I think if you ask a lot of Wings fans, people will tell you he's doing this out of necessity. He doesn't believe or trust that anybody else on that team can handle this level of competition. That being said, is it worthwhile to the development of Mo Seider to see him struggle through this? I don't know. Those are questions that we now can talk about because we have a better estimate of how difficult these minutes are, and seeing that these are arguably the most difficult minutes we've had in, the analytics era, being given to a 22-year-old defenseman, on a team that still has a lot to be desired from their defensive structure. And he's sort of put in a position where he has to defend the top players every night and start in his defensive zone, so much more than other players. I think it is something that we have to talk about now, and it's something that should be examined in a larger picture. And we can, there may even be a way with Dom's metrics to garner almost a coaching efficiency. If you were to compare a player's expected rating versus their actual rating and see how many coaches are able to get those expected ratings within the ballpark of their actual ratings, to see how many coaches are sort of achieving optimal deployment, if you will. I think that would be a very fascinating thing to consider, because I do have questions about it when it comes to Derek Lalonde and Mo Seider right now. I just don't think we're getting the best version because of how challenging these minutes are.
Yeah, it's kind of from a greater long-term Red Wings perspective, and I think I said this on a show at one point with our pal Dmitry Filipovich at the PDO cast, where wasn't the point of all of Steve Yzerman's moves to bring in all of these guys to protect Mo Seider, to let him be Mo Seider, the point of bringing in Justin Hall, the point of re-signing Oli Mata, the point of having Sherratt and Petrie there. Now Sherratt and Petrie, Jeff Petrie takes a little bit more grief probably than he should. Jeff Petrie is a fine addition for his cost. You got to look at just what he's fine. He takes more heat than he should. But at the end of the day, when you added all of these guys in, the Justin Hall one is clearly the biggest admission that it was a mistake, right? He's being healthy scratched. They've called up Simon Edvinsson. He's effectively done. They will have to find a way to get rid of Justin Hall. But it goes back to, this isn't just a Derek Lalonde question. This also goes to a Steve Yzerman management question. You made mistakes when you built your defensive core. I would be fine with, honestly, if this was Mo Seider's deployment and it was, and your defense core was also featured Edvinsson from the start of the year. I know he's playing now. Edvinsson from the start of the year. And also featured, maybe you brought up another prospect that you actually gave a chance, or you didn't spend this much on other guys. I would be okay with it. This is both a coach question and a management question that now has to be kind of discussed. And I don't know. I want to see, personally, being here in Detroit, going to most Red Wings games, I want to see the best version of Mo Seider. I think it's more fun for all of us if we see the best version of Mo Seider. I don't know if this gets us the best version of Mo Seider 3-4 years from now. I don't know. It's kind of a big, it's a big question I don't have the answer to, and I will never honestly get the answer to because I don't get the time machine, right? I really like your thought on how do we apply this to coaching to see which coaches and which players are getting the most. And it's kind of one of those where I've gone through and scrolled through that story 100 times where with the individual team charts, and there's interesting things that always pop up to me, right? I'm a big Roman Josi fan. I think Roman Josi is, for me right now, spoiler alert, Greg Wyshynski is doing another straw poll of voters right now. I'm one of the people who votes in that. In the straw poll, I have Josi as my Norris Trophy winner right now. And part of the I can hear argument one way or the other, but one of the things that I am even more impressed with Josi is go through Dom's stuff and I look at Yossi's doing what he's doing, and he's in the hard offense and hard defense sector. He's doing this in both sectors. And there's other little context across the league that I look at with this spot but even he's not facing what Mo Seider is. He had a chance, and I'd be fascinated to see what Josi faced early in his career. He had the chance to be, I believe, I don't know for sure, but I believe Josi had the chance early in his career to be Roman Josi, to figure it out. Mo Seider is the ultimate sink or swim experiment, and I think people will look back on how he performs in the future. I think 10 years from now, we're going to have the discussion about how Mo Seider did with this. It's either going to open the door for other teams to overly test a 22-year-old, or it's going to be the cautionary tale of, look what Detroit could have had but they wore him into the ground and he never developed that other spot. Like, even Brock Faber, right? This is another good one for me, right? Like, another interesting data point. Like, we're hearing the Connor Bedard versus Brock Faber Calder Trophy debate. And we see a lot of the things that get pointed out about Brock Faber. He plays 25 minutes a night. He's doing this as a rookie. Yada, 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 yada. Fine. He's, like, as of Dom's data, like, Middleton and Brodin are getting tougher assignments on a regular basis than Brock Faber is. And I'm not taking anything away from what Brock Faber's done, but I'm less impressed with Brock Faber because I hear all this narrative and I hear, and part of it is the Minnesota media is really pushing the Calder and everything like that for him. But at the end of the day, and now one's up for an award, one's not. So, but like at the end of the day, put Brock Faber in Mo Seider's space and I bet he would get cranked. So,
that's spot on. And really, I don't want to belabor the coaching aspect too much, but I genuinely think the question that you have to answer this offseason, if you're Steve Yzerman, and it's a question the Buffalo Sabres have had to go through with Rasmus Dahlin and previously, with Tyler Myers when he was their Calder winner, and having to play very difficult minutes, is what is the best thing for your team long term? And that's what you should be thinking about as the general manager. The coach obviously is focused on the specific season, game to game to game. But the best thing for your team long term, based on how Steve Yzerman has set this team up, is Mo Seider being a bona fide number one. And sinking in this, level of competition, not being able to leverage really his best attributes, which is skating the puck up, being able to, defend the rush with a tight gap, which he can't do when his forwards are constantly allowing 3-on-2s behind him. It's maybe not going to be the best case scenario. And if you botch Mo Seider's development into this bona fide number one, you are genuinely looking at another rebuild for this Red Wings team. You're going to have to look at another full teardown and another rebuild because you don't have the pieces to not have Mo Seider be at least a bona fide one, if not two at the worst. You don't have the pieces. You've got to salvage his development here. This is not Buffalo where if you burn through, Dahlin, you still have Owen Power there. You still have, Bowen Byram that you've now picked up in a deal. You've got other pieces there to be able to handle that. So it's not that. You have to get the best out of Mo Seider, and I just don't know that it's this level of deployment for him right now. And so that's certainly something the Wings are going to have to figure out this offseason.
I wonder sometimes, and this is, I don't know for sure at all, and this is a theory. I wonder if the Wings overly watched what happened at IHF World Championships back in the spring last year. Because it was one of those where, remember, Seider was one of the best players. I'm not sure how many other people watch, but Derek Lalonde was there. He was helping coach Team USA. So maybe but Mo Seider, when he plays for Germany, that's the role Mo Seider has to play with Germany, right? Like he had to play against every single top line. He played whatever the minutes were, 28 minutes a night or something like that for Germany. He's one of the best players in the tournament at World Championships. And this, I'm saying, I want to be clear, this is just me speculating, wondering, and a question that I would love to, in an uncut question, to an uncut, non-Zoom, everyone's at a podium question to Red Wings management and staff. I'd love to know if they watched Mo Seider play his role for the German national team and then said, you know what? He can do that in the NHL. We can just take it that way. I really wonder that. I wonder how much of that was the case, because to me, maybe I'm completely wrong. I could be completely wrong. I've been wrong many, many times. That's fine. But I would love to be able to ask that question in a more uncut, hey, we're at a podium and after a game or after a morning skate, or Steve Yzerman not on a Zoom conference, something where I could actually get the truth serum on the answer on that. It
would be a fascinating question to have answered. And, I think it's certainly one that you bring up, and it's very valid in what they saw. And we have seen other teams have to do this, but we've just never seen anybody do it to this extent. I mean, the closest thing I can think of is the New Jersey Devils, kind of a few years ago doing this to Andy Green. But Andy Green was not a 22-year-old rookie defenseman that you're expecting to be your stud. Andy Green was a veteran 35-year-old defenseman that, had been doing this for a long time, was known as this defensive stalwart, and you were sort of just trotting him out there to block shots, eat minutes, be physical, and that's what you wanted. And you were doing it to sort of free up your other defensemen to be able to be a little bit more aggressive, with offensive minutes. That's not Mo Seider, and that's not the type of usage that I think ultimately gets the best out of Mo Seider. And, you just think about what other teams are doing. Vegas is a great example on how, Alex Pietrangelo sort of takes the tougher minutes so Shea Theodore can take the easier offensive minutes. They're finding ways to free up the guys that sort of have that skill to be able to do that. It's just, those are the types of things that I think you have to figure out as a coach and as a general manager in terms of what's going to be best for the Wings moving forward. But ultimately, we get nowhere to being able to talk about this without Dom stepping up to be able to answer this question, challenge a historical kind of decades worth of work with a new approach that I think gets us much closer to what a lot of people visually pick up and see. And so for that, I think we have to give massive kudos to Dom for pulling that through. And, for those that haven't seen the piece, we'll make sure it's linked in the show notes along with, Sean's article on Mo Seider's conversation about advanced stats usage and shift wins and sort of the other articles talking about the level of competition here. And so, all that being said, Sean, I want to bring it back to you to kind of close us out with some final thoughts and kind of anything else you've got on your mind.
Yeah. One of the things we've said on this show, but I kind of want to reiterate, I think we're in kind of a really cool part of the hockey evolution when it comes to data understanding and where it's going. I think we've kind of, we're at least getting to the spot where we can have these meeting halfway conversations. And I think this is the type of stuff that we need to keep normalizing as part of the things and asking why, from a hockey media perspective, we need to do a better job of being willing to admit we don't know how something works, or being willing to question and ask dumb questions on things at times. And to me, this is not that Dom asked a dumb question, but this is where Dom looked at something and went back. And I think that's my big takeaway on this is I want more like this. I want more people to be accepting of this in general. And I think we are getting closer to that space. So I think it's kind of cool. I hope that there's people who read this who are writing about teams and everything, that they start to kind of find ways to better use this in their context or have these greater conversations. That's my big call to action, right? Like now that we have the data, let's use it and let's find ways, whether it's talking to players, whether it's putting proper context on a debate of whether this guy or that guy should be in the lineup. Let's do that. The other big thing for me that's just as we keep going through all of this and we see the most Seider discourse in particular, right? And it's one of the things is there's so much of this game in hockey that you can't. It's not the black and white thing we want to be able to break it down to. There's so much of the nuanced debate of, you know what? My solution personally, and it's one of those my solution personally, when you play Tampa Bay and you get into the playoffs, you know what? Maybe you want Mo Seider playing that minute, but maybe right now you also need to see what else you have. I think there's all this nuance of that we need to remember that gets lost, that's gotten lost a lot in the kind of vitriol of, well, it's either data versus this. And I think, so I know I've repeated that point a couple times on this podcast, and I know that, but to me, that's the big one, because there's so many times I talk to players, or I talk to people in hockey media in particular. There's so many people that you speak to And there's some really good ones. There's some people who are willing to look at this and figure it out. But there's a lot of people who are still writing or on broadcasts that will see something like this and will either have the reaction of, well, I already knew that. I didn't need some nerd to tell me this. Or the reaction will be, well, that's another weird number and whatever. Those people are probably not listening to this show. So if you're listening to this show, and if you've made it this far in this show, thank you. But to those people, if you do randomly make it this far in the show, like, take some time to just look at this and just try to understand that it's not science coming to try to steal your religion. It's science trying to come to meet your religion. And that is not as smooth as your read, mid-show ad read, but it's as smooth as I'll get today.
Well, to summarize, I come from a medicine background, and there's kind of a common phrase that's tossed around in medicine that I also think is applicable in hockey. And it's sort of, the longer you're in medicine, the less you see things black and white, and the more you learn to embrace the gray. And I think the same thing has to be said for hockey. The longer you analyze hockey, the longer you look at hockey, the longer you watch, the longer the more time you spend, you'll realize that there is nothing black and white here. Everything is gray, and it's understanding probabilities, likelihood, and sort of going with what maybe is the most likely scenario or the least likely scenario, but understanding that you could be wrong, understanding that there is not an easy answer to this all the time. And so sort of leave everybody with that, because that's the point of the show. And so with that, that'll kind of wrap us up here today with Expected by Whom. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please direct those to the inbox of Ryan Hanna. All right, folks, we'll see you guys shortly.